Everyone remembers the coins. Almost no one notices when Judas had already sold himself, and this is where the simple version begins to crack. The story is usually told in the easiest possible way. One disciple, one secret deal, 30 pieces of silver, and one betrayal. Clean, efficient, almost suspiciously convenient. But Judas did not appear as some distant enemy waiting in the shadows. He was already close. He walked with Jesus. He listened. He watched. He sat at the table. He knew the roads, the routines, the places where the group stopped. He knew the face of the man he would eventually hand over. That is what makes the story harder to dismiss. The betrayal did not come from someone completely outside. It came from someone who knew the way from the inside. Judas did not need to break into the circle. He had already been invited in. In modern terms, he had the address, the password, the schedule, and the trust. Then he slowly turned all of it into something that could be traded. That is not just greed. It is proximity without loyalty, presence without surrender, access without faithfulness. Judas could hear the truth and still keep a private room inside himself where the truth was not allowed to enter. And that is uncomfortable because it means closeness can look like commitment without actually becoming commitment. Someone can stand near what is good and still calculate what it is worth. Someone can sit at the table and still think like a buyer. Someone can follow the road and still resist where the road is going. Judas had not yet made the famous agreement. No coins had changed hands. No signal had been given. No soldiers were waiting. But something had already started. A small distance, a quiet calculation, a growing habit of measuring what should never have been measured. The danger was not that Judas knew too little. He knew too much to pretend he did not understand who Jesus was. He had seen enough. He had heard enough. He had been close enough. And still, somewhere inside, loyalty was being replaced by evaluation. What was this movement worth? What could be gained? What could be controlled? Those questions do not sound dramatic at first. They sound practical, responsible even. That is usually how bad decisions introduce themselves. They rarely walk in wearing a sign that says, "This will ruin everything." They arrive with a reasonable tone and very good posture. Nothing looked finished yet. Judas was still walking beside the others, still hearing the same words, still appearing to belong. From the outside, the circle looked complete. Inside it, however, one man had started turning trust into a calculation. By the time silver entered the story, Judas had already begun treating relationship like leverage. The money did not create the betrayal. It only gave a number to something already broken, and the coins were not even the beginning. The betrayal did not begin with the agreement. The agreement only gave a price to what was already broken. Before the silver, there was a crack. It may have started as quiet disappointment. Judas had followed Jesus closely enough to watch the crowds grow, the tension rise, and the possibilities multiply. A movement was forming. People were listening. Leaders were nervous. Something important was clearly happening. And Judas may have expected that importance to look different. Maybe he imagined a visible victory, a stronger political move, a clear path toward influence, something practical, measurable, and preferably useful. Instead, Jesus kept talking about surrender. He spoke about serving instead of ruling, losing life instead of securing it, and carrying a cross instead of climbing toward power. Not exactly the career plan Judas may have had in mind, because following someone holy while expecting personal advantage has always been a flawless strategy. Obviously, the deeper problem was not simply money, it was control. Judas seemed to want a result he could understand, a kingdom he could point to, a victory he could calculate. But Jesus did not behave like a project that could be managed. He refused to fit neatly into the kind of plan Judas could measure. He did not flatter ambition. He did not promise status. He did not turn loyalty into a promotion system. Judas stayed near, but his expectations may have started pulling in another direction. It was like joining a company because he expected to become a partner, then discovering the founder had never promised him a chair at the top. The disappointment did not have to be loud. It could sit quietly. It could grow every time Jesus chose humility over spectacle, mercy over force, and sacrifice over control. A crack like that rarely looks dangerous at first. It looks like a private opinion no one else needs to hear. From the outside, Judas still looked like a disciple. He traveled with the group. He heard the same teaching. He stood in the same rooms. Nothing about his position had visibly changed. That was the dangerous part. A person can keep the same seat, the same title, and the same appearance, while becoming completely different inside. Judas may have been comparing the Jesus in front of him with the leader he wanted Jesus to become. And every comparison widened the crack. That is how betrayal often grows. Not in one dramatic moment, but through private complaints that are never challenged. This is not what was supposed to happen. This is not where he thought the movement was going. Eventually, frustration begins looking for permission. Once Judas began judging Jesus by his own expectations, disloyalty could start feeling reasonable. He was no longer simply following, he was evaluating. He was no longer asking what was true. He was asking whether the truth was still useful to him. The crack was no longer merely private. And suddenly the crack had a market, and then someone offered a price. Then Judas makes the agreement, and betrayal gets a price. Now it is no longer just a thought. It has terms. It has timing. It has people waiting for him to act. The choice leaves the private world and enters the real one. That is the dangerous moment. Some decisions feel small while they are hidden. They live inside a person where they can still be edited, softened, denied, or renamed. But once they move outward, they begin creating consequences of their own. Judas may have believed he was still in control. Maybe he thought the agreement was only pressure. Maybe he imagined he could force a reaction, speed up the conflict, or push events in a direction he understood. Maybe he simply believed he could manage the risk. That is how people often speak to themselves before doing something irreversible. I know what I am doing. I know how far this will go. I can stop it when I need to. Almost every moral disaster has heard some version of that speech. The men offering the money did not need Judas to understand every consequence. They only needed access. He knew where Jesus might be. He knew when the crowds would be smaller. He knew how to identify him quickly. What Judas saw as a controlled arrangement, they saw as an open door. And the problem with selling access is that once the door opens, the seller no longer decides who walks through it. The agreement changed everything. Before it, Judas could still pretend the crack was only frustration, a private disagreement, a few disappointed expectations. After it, the betrayal had shape. There was now a promise attached to it, a reward attached to it, a future moment waiting to happen. It was like sending a destructive message in anger and realizing seconds later that the screenshot had already left the conversation. The message may have taken one moment to send. The consequences do not care. Judas had turned suspicion into cooperation. He had given his inner distance an external plan, and now the plan could begin moving without asking his permission every step of the way. That is the illusion at the center of the agreement. He may have believed he was using the people who wanted Jesus arrested. They may have believed they were using him. Everyone thought they understood the transaction. Very efficient, very professional. Nothing could possibly go wrong. But betrayal is rarely obedient to the person who starts it. Once released, it grows beyond intention. It gathers other people, other motives, and other decisions. The agreement had now moved from his mind into the hands of people who had no reason to protect him from its consequences. The silver did not simply reward Judas. It tied him to what came next. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. Now it was a path. And a path requires a direction. It requires a moment. It requires someone to point. And now the choice needed a face. And here, the betrayal stops being an agreement. It becomes a gesture. Judas approaches Jesus, not as a soldier, not as a declared enemy, not as someone standing outside the circle with a weapon in his hand. He comes as someone who still looks familiar, someone who still appears to belong. That is the heavy part. The betrayal does not arrive through distance. It arrives through proximity. Judas does not hand over a stranger. He hands over someone whose voice he knows, whose habits he knows, whose face he has seen in quiet moments when no crowd was watching. The choice that had lived in secret now needs a signal, and Judas uses closeness itself. That is what makes the scene more than a transaction. This is not simply money changing hands. It is intimacy being turned into a tool. The man who walked near the truth tries to negotiate the truth as if it were merchandise. Very practical, very organized, and completely blind to what he is actually trading. Judas may still have believed he was controlling the moment. He chooses the place. He chooses the signal. He arrives with the group. For a few seconds, it may have looked as though the plan was still his, but the moment the signal is given, the agreement becomes action. The hidden deal now has a face. It has witnesses. It has hands reaching forward. It has consequences moving faster than Judas can call them back. In modern terms, it is like using the password of someone who trusted him, opening the door, and then calling it strategy. The access was real. The trust was real. And that is exactly why the betrayal worked. An enemy from the outside might have been noticed. Judas was dangerous because he was recognized. He could come close without raising alarm. He could stand near Jesus without appearing out of place. The very thing that once proved belonging now became the mechanism of betrayal. That is the reversal at the center of the scene. Closeness had become leverage. Trust had become information. Relationship had become access. And access had become a weapon. The famous moment is not the beginning of Judas's fall. It is the exposure of it. Everything that had been hidden inside him is now visible in one act. The quiet disappointment, the need for control, the calculation, the agreement. All of it arrives at once. And then the transaction is complete. Judas has sold him. But completion does not feel like victory. The coins that once looked like advantage begin to change shape. They are no longer payment, they are evidence, they are weight. And for the first time, Judas begins to see what the deal has actually cost. There is no celebration waiting for him, no promotion, no clean escape. Only the terrible discovery that a successful betrayal can still feel like failure the moment it succeeds. And nothing about the transaction feels finished. Then the silver starts to feel heavy. Judas sold Jesus. And too late he discovered that he could not buy the way back. That is the center of the story. He made the deal. He received the silver. He gave the signal. He watched the consequences move forward. And then the price changed. The coins that had looked useful now looked unbearable. What had felt like control now felt like evidence. Judas could hold the money, count it, return it, throw it down. But none of those actions could make the night reverse itself. That is the difference between regret and repair. Regret can arrive in a moment. Repair needs time, access, and the possibility of undoing what was done. Judas no longer had that possibility. He could return the silver. He could admit the betrayal. He could wish he had chosen differently, but he could not force the consequences to walk backward. The men who paid him had what they wanted. They had access. They had custody. They had momentum. And momentum is not known for politely asking whether the original decision-maker has changed his mind. Judas had believed the agreement was something he could manage, a controlled move, a transaction with limits, something he could enter and, if necessary, exit. Very optimistic. But some choices do not remain inside the hands of the person who makes them. They move into other hands, other motives, other systems. By the time Judas wanted out, the decision was no longer waiting for his permission. It was like trying to stop a fire after selling the match. He could point to the flame. He could admit where it came from. He could hate what it had become. But the fire did not return to the box. That is why the story of Judas is not only about greed, it is about the illusion of control. He thought he could sell access and still control the outcome. He thought he could take the payment without becoming part of what the payment released. He thought the transaction would end when he decided it was over. It did not. And the tragedy was not simply that he felt guilty. It was that he had nowhere healthy to carry that guilt. Feeling the weight of what he had done was not the same as knowing what to do with the weight. He looked backward and saw the moment clearly. The crack, the calculation, the agreement, the gesture, the consequence. Everything connected now. That is how irreversible choices often look in hindsight. The path that once seemed manageable suddenly appears obvious, step by step, after there is no easy step left to undo. Judas had sold Jesus for silver, but silver could not purchase reversal. It could not restore trust. It could not close the door it had opened. It could not call back the people already moving through it. The payment returned. The damage remained. That was the final truth. He sold Jesus for coins, but he could not buy the way back.